Hello, everyone. Thanks for a nice introduction. Thanks for the warm welcome. Thanks for giving me a chance to also learn how to pronounce Raleigh. And great to be here. First time in the southern area of the US for me. And yeah, my name is Kasper or Johannes, because I work for a Greek agency. Yeah, the topic of today is coordinating vulnerability disclosure and in the EU. And what does that mean? So what's on the menu? I start by presenting some of the coordinates of practical vulnerability coordination in the EU, after having introduced ENISA first and for all, which is, by the way, not the Brooklyn Singer that I'm talking about, but I'm talking about the European Cybersecurity Agency. Now, we will also talk about some of our work in progress. So sketching out some of the deliverables that we're working on currently. And yeah, and then again, question and answer session in the end. So I think there's a lot of things probably that need to be more clarification than the presentation will provide. So please feel free to engage with me or ask questions technically even if you care, and I will try to answer them. So let's get things started. So ENISA in a nutshell is a relatively small agency. So I don't know if you're, let's say, firm or have a good understanding of the European policy ecosystem, but there are multiple agencies in the European Union for distinct subject areas. ENISA is dealing with cybersecurity and is therefore called the European Union Cybersecurity Agency. Its budget listed here is comparably small if you compare it to other agencies doing work in that area, with a total staff of 130. That is actually quite mixed in terms of representation from the member states, because even though the agency is located in Greece, a lot of member states sent experts to the agency for a certain time frame. Me, myself, I'm actually sent to ENISA by BSI, the European, actually the German Federal Agency for Cybersecurity, or yeah, called BSI. And I'm working for ENISA now for approximately 3 years, and will do so another year before returning to BSI approximately next year. So the staff is mixed, and because it was highlighted this morning, the mentioned topic, or basically the Women Cybersecurity Initiative here in North Carolina, we have this also, and just to mention it, a very nice coverage in ENISA. Despite being a technical agency, we have about parity in terms of gender balance. It's not really, let's say, critical, but it's a nice opportunity to mention that this was kind of like by natural growth, by natural development. So there were no initiatives like foreseeing or intensifying the hiring of female staff, but it just happened that we have quite a nice balance in terms of women being interested in the subjects. The agency was founded in 2004. It became or received a permanent mandate only in 2019. And we have currently 3 offices. The headquarters is in Athens, Greece, yet Ioannis, and the local offices, we have 2, one in Crete for historic reasons and one in Brussels, quite recently opened. So in comparison to the agency size, we have a diverse collection of topics that we are dealing with. Noteworthy, when I started to work in the CSIRT area of BSI, the first topic that I was confronted with, where ENISA was actually taking an initiative, was the Cyber Europe exercising. That's like a bi-yearly exercise happening, engaging all of European cybersecurity agencies as well as the private sector. So quite a big exercise that ENISA is planning and running. And that was basically my first encounter, actually. But on the side of things that also caught my interest quite rapidly was the maturity building, the training that was delivered by ENISA. So a lot of training materials available, for example, on the website, on CSIRT, topics, incident response, even vulnerability coordination, multiple other topics as well, on behalf specifically on CSIRT focus topics. So maturity building in CSIRTs, CSIRT services, building up CSIRTs in Europe was, for the time being, a very big topic at ENISA due to the mission of the agency. I will get to that on the next slide. But we have multiple topics also that basically ENISA received a mandate over the years for. One very big topic, for example, is standards and certification. ENISA is the agency now providing certification schemas for the European Union, for national certification entities to pick up and to use and to certify products on. Also trust services, also situational awareness and CTI, of course, has gathered attraction, but a big element also on behalf of European Union cybersecurity response mechanisms and crisis response mechanisms also. So just to give you a vague idea of what we're dealing with, maybe you have stumbled over some of the ENISA's reports and publications. We have quite a big range of these, and some of them may attract your interest. Okay, ENISA's mission. So we're here to create and achieve a high common level of cybersecurity across Europe. So 27 sovereign member states with distinct cyber crisis response mechanisms, some of them initially not having CSIRTs in place, not national CSIRTs, I mean, created like an incentive to work on this and to basically support European Union trust building between the member states, and also to basically support trust in the digital ecosystem in order to deal with, let's say, the more and more appearing incidents that have been reported and that were creating also a lot of attention on multiple layers on the citizen side, but of course also on the policy side. With that said, ENISA from the beginning had a key role in enabling the Union's ambition to reinforce digital trust together with the member states and EU bodies. So this is really a key part of the work that we do. And if you compare the limited budget and limited staff that we have, this is only working because we have a big, like say, network. And I would like to compare that also to the slogan of the local university here, the wolf pack. So if you call one, you might get a pack. So we have here, of course, this in place in the European Union ecosystem, that we have 27 national CSIRTs at least, and supporting the work of ENISA together with their cybersecurity agencies and all the work they do on the national side. To bring these communities together, the agency continues to contribute and strengthen Europe's preparedness and response capabilities for cyber incidents. And we do so not only with the member states, but we also collaborate strongly with EU bodies. Most importantly, I would like to name two of them. Of course, Europol with its EC3 center, and of course, CERT-EU as the CSIRT for the European bodies and agencies, European institutions, bodies, and agencies. So they also received a new name lately, but I think it's not well established. So CERT-EU is kind of like, if you will, a governmental CSIRT on the European level for the European agencies and Commission, Parliament, Council, etc. So this basically, the mission is then transposed in strategic objectives. We have a number of them. Most importantly, starting with strategic objective number one is empowering and engaged communities across the cybersecurity ecosystem. Only together with our partners from the industry, from the national side, from the cybersecurity agencies, from universities, public and private, and educational, we can basically build and collect the resources for the work. So ENISA, for that reason, has multiple networks that we're maintaining, supporting, providing secretariat service. on the ISAC side, but also on the CSIRT side, but also on the educational side. That is basically that are being utilized or like, I don't know, used to practice knowledge sharing, and also some of the work that we do on behalf of the foresighting of potential cybersecurity threats that might be arriving, that might not have been a practical implementation today yet, but that comes, of course, that may technological development will bring with them. ENISA then is also organized in 4 units currently, dealing with some of these strategic objectives. But the other 4 that are listed here, basically the outer circle, are cybersecurity as being mandate or necessary to put into policy implementation. So basically integral part that when policy developments are taking place, that these aspects are being supported by ENISA, and we kind of act as a consultant on that behalf for policymakers, but also supporting member states, of course, and on behalf of the implementation of these policy developments. So that's a big part of the work. Trusted solutions, needless to say, many developments on behalf of IoT security, now AI, supply chain security, all these topics are of relevance. One specific report, for example, that has been created by ENISA is a supply chain security report that was well received. Again, if you have interest in that, please have a look at our website. On behalf of capacity building, I mentioned Cyber Europe exercise, I mentioned training. A lot of work is flowing into that area. And on behalf of operational cooperation and cybersecurity, also a lot of work is flowing into that area, and I will get into a little bit more details, I think, here. We have an operational cooperation unit. It's also separated in 3 locations, mainly in Brussels and Athens currently. This unit consists of 27 experts. It has a budget that is approximately the same as the whole agency's budget. It might sound a little bit strange, but we're actually supporting member states with additional services that we're actually procuring on their behalf. So on their interest, they can request, let's say, incident response support, or they can request penetration services, penetration testing services, or even, I don't know, other kind of risks monitoring or threat assessment reports, attack surface monitoring. So this kind of budget is obliged for that activity and is basically distributed by the agency and translated into services for the member states. We currently have in our unit 8 SNEs, so seconded national experts that I mentioned before. One of them, that's me. And we contribute to 3 of the before mentioned strategic objectives and activities. So the activities are then translated, of course, in closer broken down objectives. One of them is covering the EU vulnerability database implementation and related services. I translate this here to CVD support and EUVD. But as part of this distribution or basically explanation that I will present to you now, I will go also a little bit more in detail beyond that, what ENISA is doing, but specifically covering also what the member states are doing and are obliged to be doing. Starting on that, we need to, again, I'm sorry about that, start with the legislation. The guiding legislations mentioned here are the 2 of them that are actually formally implemented and finalized. So that's one, the Cybersecurity Act, which gave ENISA the final mandate in 2019, the permanent mandate, I mean, covering a lot of the subject areas that we're today dealing with, also highlighting topics as the certification framework that I mentioned before, and multiple other topics. ENISA is on that regard, for example, preparing a quarterly cyber assessment report for the European Union that is made available to European member state cybersecurity agencies and European Union bodies and agencies. So basically, it's more like a closed report, but on a quarterly basis, we provide that assessment on what has been happening and what we expect to be happening in the nearer future. Secondly, the first NIST directive and the second NIST directive are even more important on behalf of the topic of vulnerability disclosure. Especially the first NIST directive for the first time created the European CSIRTs network, which is a formal, kind of like the one and only formal CSIRT network, I think, in the world, at least I know of. So every CSIRT, every member state was actually requested to assign at least one national CSIRT in order to cover the also basically defined by this directive critical infrastructure sectors in each member state. So each of these sectors have a responsibility to report incidents to respective CSIRTs. It can be a central national CSIRT. It can be a diverse set of CSIRTs covering different sectors. All of these CSIRTs are basically contributing and are members of the European CSIRTs network. On top of that, also CERT-EU. So we have quite a big network currently, about approximately 40 members. It's basically the basis for whatever we do on behalf of collaboration, on behalf of incidents, on behalf of vulnerability work, and a couple of other topics as well. Most of the work is actually happening on a daily basis, but we have escalation mechanisms in place because on top of the CSIRT network, there's also another network created for crisis reaction, which is called the Cyclone network. But I'm not going to get into too much detail about that, but CSIRT network is really the kind of like the backbone of the work here. We have, as part of the NIST directive, also certain activities that have been mandated to being implemented by the member states, because a directive is a regulation that needs to be translated into national law before it becomes active, whereas an act, as a Cybersecurity Act, becomes directly unfolds its legislative meaning directly. So that's a little bit of the differentiation between these kind of legislation efforts in the European Union. Not everybody needs to know that, but it's important to understand sometimes how long things take until they actually become active, or you get a feeling of actually why is that like taking so long. For example, each CSIRT network member should be, or let's say like every member state should be implementing a central coordinator for vulnerability disclosure and a CVD policy. That's currently taking a while, but it's just for your background now, because of this directive and the time it takes to implement, that's one of the reasonings. And two more legislation or work of legislations are also quite important in the context of vulnerability disclosure. One is the CRA, the Cyber Resilience Act, which is kind of dealing with the topic of security by default for product maintainers, legislation basically that on behalf of reporting exploited vulnerabilities and taking care of, let's say, the security of their products. But a lot of discussion was happening around that. Again, not covered in detail here. If you have questions, I'm happy to talk about these. And the second legislation that's also kind of in the pipeline is the Cyber Solidarity Act, but that's dealing more with the topic of incident response and basically the collaboration between the member states on behalf of incident response. ENISA also has a big part in that. So what does ENISA do on behalf of supporting vulnerability disclosure? Again, we have multiple areas of work, let's say. On the policy side, we have been developing national CVD programs where basically the colleagues have supported the policy creation process, and the vulnerability database development was more or less initially also guided by them to a certain degree. The capacity building side includes, again, peer learnings on vulnerability disclosure, the development of CVD policies, and providing guidance on that behalf. Then on the certification side, we have basically the obligation that national certification authorities participate in information sharing, certain embargo periods. So there's basically a methodology developed on behalf of certified products. And on the operational cooperation side, yes, that's basically what I'm dealing with at the moment, developing the EU vulnerability database and related services, supporting the CVD policy development in the CSIRTs network rearm, and also supporting basically approaches and procedures on behalf of coordinating multi-vulnerability disclosure, because whenever you have multiple CSIRTs, of course, being obliged to, not obliged, but coordinating together a vulnerability of a product that may impact multiple vendors across different legislations, it becomes tricky and complex. On behalf of the before mentioned capacity building, just to mention 3 reports that have been pushed out by ENISA in 2021. There was a bigger study developed or undertaken on behalf of CVD's policies in the European Union. The main focus here was focusing on the difficulties, the concerns, the obstacles that prevent actually member states from picking up CVD policy development. So a lot of topics were covered on that regard. Then this led to a 2022 study on behalf of initial challenges and related on behalf of broader ecosystems, like not only CVD policy, but on behalf of also vendors, industry, maintainers, what is actually supporting, what is creating difficulties, how could this EU VDB support the overall progress on behalf of transparency, information sharing, what kind of information should be part of it, what is helpful, what is not so helpful, kind of covering this broader topic, but going also a little bit more into detail, so both. And then last but not least, in 2023, there was also quite a nice guideline provided. It was created together with the member states who are actually quite experienced in CVD, and it's basically creating a detailed guideline on behalf of creating a CVD policy on the national side. So if you are in the progress, as I described before, many member states are still in this progress. Here you find key points, ideas, topics of interest that you should be considering when creating a national CVD policy. Now, a bit of a jump back here, just also again to cover again the importance of CSIRT network and as it feeds into kind of like an overall escalation mechanism in the European Union. As I said, it's a formal network. So on behalf of incidents, vulnerabilities that create attraction that needs to be considered, to be assessed, a lot of sharing, a lot of exchange of ideas and understanding about what it is that we're talking about is being dealt with in the CSIRT network. So practically incident response, if you include vulnerabilities, is covered there. This may flow into, of course, when shit hit the fan, excuse my language, but into crisis coordination efforts by the second network that I mentioned that has the responsibility then to also advise and basically inform political level on the national side as well on the European side. And ENISA, the Operational Cooperation Unit that I'm working for, provides these secretariats with not only administrational coordination on behalf of creating events, organizing meetings, hosting infrastructure and tools for communications, but providing also situational awareness and CTI products for these networks on current topics, on current incidents, on current campaigns, let's say, on vulnerabilities of interest. So that's a big part of our work, and we are therefore becoming a more operational secretariat, let's say, as we speak. And just pure numbers, again, describing kind of like the consistency of the pack of the CSIRTs network. We have currently approximately 600 members, like persons in the network. It consists of 40 teams plus 30U, as explained before. It meets several times. It covers, of course, multiple work programs and founding documents. And the coordination is happening really on a daily basis. ENISA, as a secretariat, is providing additional services that I've described before. And these daily operations are provided with support more or less 24/7. Organization and sessions and plenaries are basically supporting that work. We sometimes get, for example, notified by vendors about vulnerabilities beforehand on the Secretariat side, and we utilize that opportunity to then initiate the communication, the information sharing with the CSIRT network by inviting them to calls on behalf of heads-up notifications on vulnerabilities and other topics as well. Okay, so this map should be known to everybody here by now. What I like to highlight is a little purple bubble, which is not a French village of resistance, but it is actually the location of ENISA, where we have basically started the first CNA service that is now located in Greece. Even though, as I said, we're basically having offices in multiple countries. So basically Greece is the headquarters. Therefore, this is leading to an orange circled country in the southern part of Europe here. And I will like to quickly describe also a little bit the situation in the rest of Europe. So the state of play in the European member states, as I described, the NIST directive is the second NIST directive is actually providing obligations for member states to implement certain services on behalf of supporting CVD. Most dominantly, I think we can still say that a lot of countries have already done for years great work in this realm. We have a number of countries who have, for the longest time, have well established, even like renewed and updated CVD policies in place, some of which are also CNAs, namely France, Finland, Poland, Spain, Slovakia, and the Netherlands. We have, as I said, an increasing number of member states publishing CVD policies, and a variety of these also have vulnerability databases in place already to a certain degree, quite differentiating in nature, but important to note for us as we're implementing, again, like a vulnerability database at the moment that needs to take this into consideration. On behalf of the work that is being done on database or data publication on behalf of vulnerabilities, it's important, again, that a lot of these efforts are, let's say, quite diverse in terms of language, in terms of technology, in terms of data formats that are being used, whether they include references or not, to what degree, how detailed they are. These differences don't make it easy to, let's say, build upon 27 member states publishing data on behalf of vulnerabilities. We accept the challenge and we're working on it. And I will get into a little bit more detail on how we plan to do so. But for the time being, there's no decision to have a central coordinator, let's say. When there's a vulnerability disclosure process that has been triggered, member states are responsible for that. The coordinators of the member states, as described in the CVD policies, should be contacted. And ENISA only supports that effort as a second line of support on behalf of coordination when requested, when multiple countries are may be impacted. Let's say a country had an incident for a product where the vendor is located in another country, ENISA can come in handy in that regard, and so supporting these member states to find an approach to handling that. Also taking into consideration that different CVD policies and different legislations, of course, come with different embargo periods, come together, lead to different requirements on behalf of reporting, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of harmonization also needed on that regard. On that side, I think I would like to quickly check the time before, oh yes, okay. Before going into like just highlighting again what I described before, mostly we have a couple of countries who fully activated their services, including CVD policy and CNA services. We have a couple of countries that have picked up within the last 1 or 2 years the capability and published CVD policies. And a number of countries that's not highlighted here, but also have pushed out, basically updated vulnerability data sharing services. One of the latest ones that I noted was Croatia. They have actually quite a good service on that regard now available too. All right, now ENISA is having certain obligations also. So we're in the process of creating, as I mentioned, the EU vulnerability database. We for the time being, we kind of like put a lot of work into collecting stakeholder feedback. We prepared basically specifications needed to implement, let's say, resource assignments, et cetera. We conducted a workshop last year. Some of the people here, I think, participated even, and it was very, very nice and supportive for our work. We have been basically, even though not specifically mentioned in the legislation, a registry service was mandated, but we kind of course, interpreted it and became a CVE, integrating the CNA service actually as a consortium, because, as I mentioned before, we're closely liaising and coordinating our work with the European CSIRTs. On the data collection approach, we prioritize vulnerabilities that are either reported by regional researchers or disclosed by European CSIRTs, or that actually are reported to, let's say, European CSIRTs and affecting European vendors. The decision on having a coordinator, as mentioned before, only if requested by members of the CSIRT network, by the national POCs, meaning, and the level of interconnection of databases. This is also a big challenge here, as I described before, but we try to overcome that as much as possible, because one of the legislation requirements was that we build upon the CSIRT network assessments on vulnerabilities, and we don't come up with, let's say, a manual approach that we could not actually staff and that we could not support. So we try to synchronize as much as possible with existing standards and approaches and data that is made available by the national CSIRTs. What do we have in place currently? Well, each and every important vulnerability is broadly covered by CSIRTs. We collect these advisories and warnings, and we publish them as like a CSIRT network bulletin. So you will find that under ENISA EU's GitHub repository, together with a lot of additional CSIRT network material, best practices, vulnerability handling guidelines, etc. Everything that is in place, we try to collect and make available on this repository. And you see here that this approach is currently being done. We publish the data in Markdown, more or less, but basically coming with CNA's with the CNA advisories that we will publish, we will create these repositories also in additional formats, noteworthy CSAF as the standard advisory format that or framework that we think is actually most useful for spreading information and supporting the automation. So rounding it up here a little bit, what is important about the EU vulnerability database to mention is that the available information must relate to impact software versions, of course, otherwise no use. We built upon existing standards. I think I don't surprise anybody by that. Our data synchronization with existing databases is key. The enrichment by additional assessments and contextual information is also key to create additional value. Making vulnerability data machine readable is key, and promoting and utilizing CSAF is one of the biggest priorities for us at the moment. And the milestones, the legislation I mentioned before was published end of last year. We are basically the authority and basically to register CVE IDs on behalf of EU companies at the moment and supporting those CSIRTs who are not doing it themselves. We're considering to become a root CNA for Europe, and that's basically in the making. The concept is on the vulnerability database has more or less been created, and we're in the progress of implementing it with the first POC arriving around mid-year, and then we're going into basically the testing procedure, technical assessment on behalf of creating a productive vulnerability database service, hopefully at the end of the year, maybe beginning of next year. As you know, sometimes development is not as, let's say, easy to plan when it comes to technical issues arriving. And that's bringing me to the end of the presentation. So actually, I ran through it in crazy amount of time. Sorry, I think a lot of time for questions.
If you have a question, I'll bring you the mic.
Okay, I have a lot of questions. So When you're talking about a feed in, are you expecting companies to be going somewhere to put that information in, or are you going to pull from sources like NVD? If it exists still.
Can you specify maybe what specific kind of reporting you mean? Like
Well,
vulnerabilities?
Vulnerabilities into
like
your database.
Patched vulnerabilities?
Yes.
Advisories?
Yep.
So that's basically information that is publicly available. We try to pull that again from the existing data sources, including, of course, vulnerability advisories published by vendors. Yes.
Okay, so pulling the information, great. I'm curious why a lot of the deck says CSIRTs when it seems like a lot of it might be product vulnerabilities too. So your naming convention is interesting to me.
So, sorry again.
Sorry.
The naming convention of
it's a
product certs
CSIRT.
versus CSIRTs.
Right, it's a CSIRT all over your deck when a lot of the information will be product vulnerabilities too, which is PSIRT.
Yeah, but the CSIRTs that I've been mentioning are actually CSIRTs covering not product maintainers, but covering national CSIRTs, dealing with vulnerabilities, coordination vulnerabilities, information sharing on behalf of pushing out information about critical vulnerabilities, informing their constituents about vulnerabilities. That's basically the work of the national CSIRTs, sectorial CSIRTs maybe even, but we're not talking about product certs here. This is basically the formal CSIRT that I've been talking about is actually the European Union CSIRT network that was constituted by this directive. That does not include product certs.
Johannes, I think the question, and I want to amplify, I think what Lisa's asking is, from a incident response perspective, from a product, okay, whether it's NVD or open vulnerability database, the authoritative source underneath CVE rules is the CNA. And what we're wondering is, when we wrote the PCERT services framework following the CSIRT services framework in FIRST, we found out that 70% of the FIRST board of directors had no idea what a PCERT did. And so the question we're really asking is, are you going to go to the authoritative source and get the data? And we'll publish it because most of us are starting to already publish in CSAF or VEX formats and not rely on these others who are, no offense to them, aggregators of data, and instead go to the data source. That's the question that product security incident response teams are asking, because that's the crux of the data set of where are you getting the data?
Well, the point is not every maintainer has a product cert in place. So not every maintainer of a digital product has the ability for us to go there and collect data on this kind of methodologies. I mean, of course, big vendors have that in place, but a lot of the maintainers that we're talking about, a lot of the digital product that we're also covering are not there yet, let's say. And we need to cover the full range of products.
So are you going to have then national CSIRTs who are CNAs try to work with open source maintainers? Is that your thought process of how you're going to get the data?
Well, that's one part of the area, one part of the work. It's not like that.
Okay.
We cannot enforce every.
Oh, it's not a matter of enforcement. The question is, how are we going to cultivate and work this as an ecosystem? And where and how do we get that data? What's that process? And I think what Lisa was pointing to, and I think some of us saw it on the charts, is a lot of CSIRTs don't understand the PCERT problem. Okay, in other words, they're not delivering a product that a customer pays for. Even open source has some of that. So the question really is, how do we cultivate that? And do the people who are reviewing that actually understand what they're looking at? That's the question. And it's an open question, not that you have to answer it right here, because it's how do we look forward, beyond 2024? And I think what Lisa's asking is, how do we do that and have an engagement? Because we're a large part of that. And while you may have spoken to some in the room, I think a large number of us from the PCERT community say, we haven't been part of the discussion. So
yeah,
Pete, how do we do that?
I think the point in general is that you're saying CSIRTs are going to use the data, but most likely PCERTs are going to provide a significant amount of the data. So if just clarification on that, I think would make sure that we're all playing the same story.
Yeah, it's a fair question, I think. And it's totally understood that product certs are actually providing a lot of the competence, a lot of the basically work that CSIRTs cannot provide because they are not understandable or don't have the expertise on the specifics of the products. That's totally clear. So it's a collaborative work, I think. So CSIRTs who are actually coordinating vulnerabilities will reach out to product certs and come to assessment together with them and publish their information together with what vendors are providing, and what the information they receive is basically the key for sharing that information.
Any other questions? Okay.
Hi, thanks so much for the presentation. Rob Spiger, Microsoft. I had a question for you around the CRA. The CRA mandates vulnerability reporting prior to mitigations being published when there's active exploitation. Are you planning on using those reports as the basis for entries in your database? Or would you wait and find it from other sources after mitigations are published?
So let's say the answer is, I think, multifold. So the database that we're talking about here that I've been referencing as a CRA is not functionally implemented, not formally approved. So we're not talking about this kind of reporting that flows into the vulnerability database that I've been referring to here. This is about patched vulnerabilities, advisories being available, information on mitigation being accessible publicly, basically a collective approach on basically streamlining that information and making it accessible at a central place in one database that we're kind of maintaining. Talking about the CRA, of course, we get additional information that can be very valuable and informative for customers and clients, namely whether information about exploited vulnerabilities is made accessible and to the wider public. And clearly saying, like, learning from the value that the CAF service provides, I think there should be considerations on how to make this information accessible. Of course, only after the patch is available and the information can be shared. So there's this delta in time under which the information is more sensitive and cannot be published and is not going to be made accessible through the public vulnerability database.
We had a question on Discord from Mike O'Connor. The question is, what additional services does ENISA think it will do as CRA is rolled out?
What additional resources?
What additional services would ENISA look to provide as the rollout of CRA takes place?
So the question is, what future services is ENISA expecting to do as a result of the passage of the CRA?
Well, again, we're talking about something that is not formally there yet, yeah? So please, everything I'm saying is more or less based on what people are talking about, yeah? So there are a couple of topics that are mentioned in the CRA, and I think that are very likely to stay until the formal adoption or publication, let's say. So ENISA will provide a central reporting platform together with the member states that vendors utilize to share information, as mentioned before by you. This platform is under development, or we're starting to develop that platform, and we will need to basically put a lot of work into making that work well, being accepted by not only the CSIRTs mentioned before on the member state side, but of course also the vendors. It needs to basically collect them and be easy to use and create a motivation to also to use it. So that's basically one big part of the work that I think is starting. And then of course after the CRA is then following, that we will also need to kind of provide additional assessment services on behalf of product categories that suffer under specific vulnerability. So these kind of considerations on behalf of understanding certain issues that are repetitive or that have a certain number of products that indicate that the full product range is affected. We're supposed to provide that assessment and support basically regulators also on that regard. But practically, a lot of work currently at the moment is still going into the consideration on behalf of how do we actually create the biggest value out of this legislation. So we're still really in the kind of assessment part of the legislation itself.
So while I understand this is a European agency-ish, how much collaboration and communications have you had with North American agencies and ones in Asia?
And what? North American agencies? A lot.
How much collaboration have you guys had with North American agencies and agencies in Asia that are doing similar things for coordinating vulnerability responses or IR responses?
So as I said, if you take into consideration that ENISA, like if you talk about ENISA itself, we have collaborations with CESA, we have collaborations with multiple CSIRTs across the globe and PSIRTs, and we participate in workshops and conferences such as this one, for example. But CSIRTs themselves in the 27 member states also have a lot of collaboration. So if you take that into consideration, I think there's a lot of collaboration ongoing and a lot of understanding about the issue across the different participating organizations and entities.
I think I'll add on to that because that was going to be my question. My fear is that there are going to be all these different databases. As a vendor, I'm going to have to share my information with all these different places, which is going to be an enormous amount of work. When in the end goal is that all the information is there somewhere that someone can read from. And I just don't understand why we're having all these pop up all over the place instead of, I think, the coordination amongst everybody to have a coordinated database of this information.
So how do I answer to that? I mean, a single central worldwide vulnerability database, of course, comes with risks. I mean, it has a certain scope, it has a certain, data structure, whereas multiple other vulnerability database or data services around vulnerabilities, of course, offer additional services and functionalities that are quite, let's say, well received, I think, by users. So I think it doesn't hurt to have another vulnerability database in place that may format, like say, the data in a way that picking up on additional, ideas, concepts that may have, a little bit of a difference to existing vulnerabilities. On top of that, I don't think actually that any vendor is actually mandated to do anything special for the database service that we're currently creating. I'm not talking about the CRA. The CRA is something special, of course. That's a topic that will create, of course, and create a lot of work for vendors also. But on behalf of the vulnerability data sharing, we just invite vendors to pick up on formats and making their data accessible and provide well-written advisories in a good structure that can be picked up and utilized. I mean, that's kind of like a common sense, I think, request.
Hi there. Thank you very much for your talk. I have a question. I know that you said that you're going to be using, the existing standards and all that. Do you already have a planned data exchange format that you'll be utilizing? Has that been decided on?
So I mentioned the Common Security Advisory Framework. That's basically a framework that we want to use as much as possible in order to exchange information and to make data accessible. So as an aggregator and as a trusted provider, we will build upon that framework.
Okay, thank you.
Takers, any further questions? Not seeing any hands. Oh, wait. Oh, hands.
Thanks for the talk. It was great. Can you speak a little bit about just trying to coordinate the difficulties of trying to coordinate all these member states to come together to consensus and, the sort of the decision-making process of how you get to, this one big working group?
So yeah, I think the question is a very, very nice question because I can talk a lot about that. So I can easily cover the last 20 minutes just talking about that. So I mean, the collaboration effort is taking place again on multiple layers. So when a policy draft is created, then a feedback process starts. Member states basically comment, create red lines, basically provide feedback on behalf of where it should go, what should not be covered in that much detail. And then, of course, in the policy creation process, also you have a lot of negotiating until then finally the policy document appears and is being published. Individual member states include technical experts in that process. So on the policy side, the legislation is of course processed then in the member state to the responsive or responsible, let's say, ministry or wherever the information is most noteworthy to be handled or assessed. And then, for example, National Cybersecurity Center of a specific member state gets a chance to also provide their understanding and assessment of this piece of legislation. But it's quite different how each member state handles it. So in some member states, it may happen very efficiently and very responsive without timely delays, because these policy creation processes are very tight in terms of time frames and planning. So sometimes for smaller member states, especially, it's a very great challenge to participate and provide feedback in these kind of processes. On the second part, on behalf of coordinating, actually, then let's say the realization of these documents or policy initiatives, then a lot of work also starts by ENISA, kind of like inviting, especially when it's around tasks that we are mandated to pick up on, that we provide ideas, that we invite CSIRTs then to collaborate and to provide their input, that we initiate and organize, let's say, a workshop on a specific area and collect input through these means. So this happens, let's say, again, kind of like it's a voluntary approach. Nobody is mandated to provide this feedback, but a lot of CSIRTs are, of course, based on their expertise, have great possibilities to provide insight and help us in that progress. So that's a continuous effort, let's say. Do you have any specific example that you would like to go into, or just generally? On behalf of the CSIRT network, we deal with, of course, topics that are more like on the, again, implementation side of taking into consideration perspectives, understandings, views. Noteworthy, let's say, the common reporting framework that is now supposed to be implemented by ENISA, that we need to engage with the CSIRTs to make it work and to create the structure and basically create a working a system that can be used and is distributed in a way that every member state can implement it and use it on behalf of allowing vendors then to use it on that regard. So that's really, like, I think that's going to be a lot of meetings, a lot of repetitive invitations to provide feedback, not only with the CSIRTs, but on a wider ecosystem. I think we have a lot of work on that regard, as an example. But on behalf of other topics, I think we have a lot of campaigns, working groups dealing with specific topics in the CSIRT network on behalf of the incident side, campaigns, spear phishing campaigns whatsoever. So a lot of practical work, operational work is also is taking place. But I think you were more referring to the first area of work. So basically the diversity of topics actually on the Secretariat side keeps us quite engaged.
So I have a question from the Discord, and the asker says, what schema is envisioned for the vulns in the future European database? As an example, CVSS, CWE, CPE, or something partly or completely different?
So in detail, I think I'm not going to go into details, but the backbone will, of course, be including CVE data, and therefore CVE schema will be providing kind of like a format that we will utilize on behalf of, like, say, the data that we will then display. We may enrich it, and we may build another schema that allows us to include additional information, but it's in the making, and I don't want to go into details about that at the moment.
Yeah, I just was told I have the last question, so thanks for that. Regarding the CSIRTs, you mentioned the CSIRTs are trying to pull the information from the vendors who don't have a PSIRT, as far as I understood. Is the plan that the national CSIRTs are taking care of all the vendors that are headquartered in the corresponding country to get finally the information and or establish a PSIRT that they push the information?
So, I mean, again, we're dreaming kind of like, I mean, we cannot really make things work that don't work. There's, of course, the idea that if CVD policies support member states and member states then use these CVD policies to invite maintainers and vendors to do more and do better, that this will, of course, open up possibilities that may have not been practiced until now. But I think it's fair to say that it would be nice if that would be working out that way.
Okay, we got one more question and then we'll wrap it up. Over here.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks, Johannes. Just to make sure I'm sort of reading back what I understand, the database proposed, like, we'll just use CVE, right? So it will sort of be unified. There won't really be, like, if I report something to the CVE database, then it'll go into, so there's not really multiple reporting channels. Is that right?
So on behalf of specific vulnerabilities coordinated in the member states that we will then assign CVEs for, that will flow back into the MITRE database naturally, of course.
I think one of the questions and concerns is if you're a CVE naming authority, you already have a scope. They can't override your scope if it's your area. So continue that and realize the system actually will correct there. We just haven't exercised it yet.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Wrap it up. Thank you. Appreciate it.